Okay, so we are going to begin our new unit on adding and subtracting fractions. Within this unit, we are also going to add and subtract mixed numbers as well. Let's look at some of these problems that you may have done in fourth grade. Let's look at 1/2 plus 1/2. We know that when we are adding fractions, we are actually adding that value of the fraction. So if I have 1/2 and 1/2, and I put them together and I add them together, I actually have 2/2, okay? Which you know that is an improper fraction, so I really have one whole. With that being said, if you remember from fourth grade, you will add the numerator, which is your top number, and then your bottom number will remain the same, which is 2, because you are talking about halves. So now you have 1/2 placed with another half, and now you have 2/2, which equals 1. And then we can do the same thing when we are subtracting. If I have 3/4 minus 1/4, well, if I have 3/4 in my hand and I take away 1/4, I now only have 2/4, which also simplifies down to 1/2. So what do you think you do when our denominators are unlike? So in fourth grade, you learned how to add and subtract fractions where your denominators were like, which means that your denominators are the same. But in fifth grade, we are actually going to talk about what you should do when your denominators are unlike. So let's talk about that. So let's start off by looking at the problem 1/2 plus 1/4. Okay. Well, when you have unlike denominators, which in this case we do, we have halves and we have fourths. When we talk about that, we essentially want to make our denominators like. So with that, you need to take your 1/2, which is right here, and you need to come up with an equivalent fraction that also has the same denominator as 4. Okay, and we know equivalent fractions are two fractions that have the same value, but they use different terms to represent that value. One strategy I can use to find an equivalent fraction of a half where my denominator equals 4 is to talk about those multiples of those two denominators. So let's talk about my multiples of 2 and my multiples of 4. If you look in your packet that I sent home an anchor chart where it talks about the differences between factors and multiples. In our last unit, when we multiplied fractions, we focused on how to multiply those fractions and what it means to find the product of two fractions, but we also focused on simplifying our answer to lower terms, okay? When you're simplifying an answer, that's when you want to use your factors. When you want to use your greatest common factor. When we're adding and subtracting fractions and we want to find an equivalent fraction where my denominators are equal to each other, we want to talk about the multiples of a number. Okay. And what a multiple is, if you remember, a multiple is a number where you can skip count by that number, or you can multiply where your product equals that number. So let's look at the multiples of 4. My multiples of 2. My multiples of 2 are 2, because 2 times 1 is 2. 4, because 2 times 2 is 4. 6, 2 times 3 is 6. 8, 2 times 4 is 8. And we could keep skip counting to find those multiples. So I'm going to keep going a little bit. So I'm going to go all the way up to 12. Okay. And then my multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20. And I'm going to stop right there. When we're simplifying, we want to find our greatest common factor. Okay. When we are adding and subtracting and we want to find an equivalent fraction where my denominators are like, we want to take what is called my least common multiple. Okay. So I have my multiples listed out, and I can also call that my LCM. So if you hear me refer to it as an LCM, you know that means my least common multiple. In our last unit, we talked about what those words meant. So we talked about the numbers, I have my multiples listed out. We want to talk about the multiples they have in common. So the multiples they have in common here are 4, and they also have 8 in common, and they have 12. Okay. Now there's more multiples in common between 2 and 4, but on our list here, we just have those three numbers, okay? And we want to find our least common multiple in this case, okay? So our least common multiple is 4, okay? And the purpose of finding our least common multiple is that we want to convert our denominators to equal that least common multiple, okay? So 1/4 our denominator is already 4, so I'm going to leave that one alone, okay? And let's talk about our 1/2 right here. Think about how you can take your denominator, which is 2, and convert that to a 4, right? Well, I know if I take 2 and I multiply that by 2, it will equal 4, okay? Well, whatever you do to your denominator, you also have to do to your numerator, okay? So let's go ahead and rewrite that. Well, I know that 1 times 2 is 2, and I know that 2 times 2 is 4, okay? And like I said, in 1/4, your denominator is already your least common multiple, which is 4. So I'm going to leave that one alone. And if you think about it, 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4, but now my denominators match. Okay. Well, now that my denominators match and I'm talking about fourths, well, now I can take my 2/4 and add it to my 1/4, and I now have 3/4. So 1/2 plus 1/4 equals 3/4. And I know that 3/4 cannot be simplified to lower terms, so that's as low as it's going to get, so that's my final answer. Let's look at another equation. Let's look at 3/5 plus 1/10. Okay. And again, I know that my denominators are 5 and 10, and I know I have to get those to be like denominators in order to add them. So I've got to look at my fraction of 3/5 and think of an equivalent fraction where I can get my 5 to equal my 10. Now again, you want them to be equivalent because you want them to carry the same value. You're just trying to change the denominator. So let's look at our multiples again. So let's look at our multiples of 5 and our multiples of 10. And let's list out those multiples. Now these are a little easier. So my multiples of 5 are 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. And I always just want to start out with a couple of them because you don't want to sit there and list out a ton of multiples. And if you feel like you need to find more multiples, you can go on if you want to. And then let's look at my multiples of 10. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. I usually start off with maybe my first 5 or 6. And I feel like if I need to get more, I can get more later. So let's look at all the ones that they have in common, because remember, we're trying to find that least common multiple. Let's look at all the multiples they have in common. I have 10 in common and 20, and they have 30. And again, 5 and 10 have more in common, but as of right now with the list that we have, there's only 3 on our list. Now, let's look at that least common multiple. The common multiple with the least amount of value is 10. Okay, so we want to make both of our denominators, which is that bottom number, if you remember, of a fraction, to equal 10. Well, 1/10 already has a denominator of 10, so I can leave that one alone. And I want to think of how I can make my 5 a 10. Well, I know that I can take 5 and I can multiply it by 2 to make it a 10. That's not the best looking 2. Okay. And then whatever I do to my denominator, I also want to do to my numerator. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply my 3 times 2 as well. And let's go ahead and reset that up. I know that 3 times 2 is 6 and 5 times 2 is 10. Well, now both of my denominators equal 10. So now I can add my tenths together. Well, if I have 6 tenths and I have 1/10, I know that that equals 7 tenths. Okay. And if I look at 7 tenths, 7 and 10 don't have any numbers in common, or any factors in common, so I know that 7 tenths is my final answer. Okay, let's look at one more fraction with unlike denominators. All right, if I have the fraction 5/12 and I want to add it to 3/4. Okay. Well, again, my denominators are 12 and 4, and my goal is to make those like so that I can add the two fractions together. So let's find my least common multiple of 4 and my least common multiple of 12. Because I want to take my 3/4 and I want to convert that to an equivalent fraction that carries the same value as 3/4 but has a denominator of 12. So let's look at my multiples of 4, because remember, we want to find that least common multiple and use that to convert 3/4. So let's look at our multiples of 4. I have 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24. Okay. And let's look at the number 12. My multiples of 12 are 12, 24, 36, 48. Okay. And let's make sure that we are working hard on those multiples in our multiplication facts, because as always, we're having to really utilize those multiplication facts in 5th grade. So let's look at our least common multiple, or at first, let's look at our multiples that they have in common between 4 and 12. Well, I know that 12 is a common multiple, and on my list, I have 24 as a common multiple. I want to take the least common multiple, so in this case, it is going to be 12. Okay. Well, 5/12 already has a denominator of 12, so I'm going to leave that alone. And then I'm going to take my 3/4 and I'm going to convert that to have a denominator of 12. Well, I know to convert my 4 into a 12, I need to multiply it by 3. And whatever I do to my denominator, I have to do to my numerator. So I know that 3 times 3 is 9, and 4 times 3 is 12. Okay. Well, let's look at 5/12 added to 9/12. Well, if I add those two values together, I now have 14/12. And just like any of our other fraction units, I know that 14/12 is an improper fraction, right? And we started working on improper fractions a lot in our last unit. And we got pretty good at them, so I feel pretty confident in them. So let's talk about how many whole numbers I have in the fraction 14/12. Well, I know that 12 can go into 14 one whole time, so I at least have one whole, which is 12/12. Well, if I have one whole, which is 12/12, and I have 14/12, I now have 2 of those 12ths left over, so 2/12. And if I look at 2/12, I know that my whole number is going to stay the same, but I know that 2/12 can be simplified. And this is when we're going to talk again about factors. So I have found my least common multiple of my fractions, and I have converted 3/4 to 9/12. And I know that 3/4 and 9/12 are equivalent to each other, but now my denominators matched, and I got 14/12, which is an improper fraction, and it converts to 1 and 2/12. Well, I know that 2/12 can be simplified because 2 and 12 have numbers in common. And remember, we talked about briefly at the beginning the difference between multiples and factors. Well, now we're simplifying, so now we want to talk about factors again. Let's talk about my factors of 2 and 12. And remember, a factor are numbers that can be divided into the number that you're talking about, or can be multiplied into the number you're talking about. So let's look at 2. Well, I know the only numbers that can go into 2 evenly are 1 and 2. Okay. And let's talk about my factors of 12. I have 1 and 12 are 2 numbers that can go into 12, or that I can multiply to equal 12. I can also multiply 2 and 6 to equal 12. And I can also multiply my 3 and 4 to equal 12. Okay. And remember, when we're simplifying, we want to talk about my greatest common factor, or my GCF. Okay. And the factors they have in common are 2, and that just so happens to be my greatest common factor. Okay. So I want to take my 1 and 2/12, and I want to divide it by my greatest common factor. Okay. So I want to divide it by 2 and divide it, because again, just like with our least common multiple, whatever you do to your numerator, you have to do to your denominator as well. And so my whole number, which is 1, is going to stay the same. Well, I know that 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. So my final answer is 1 and 1/6. Okay, so 5/12 plus 3/4 is 1 and 1/6. So let's look at a couple of examples where we need to be subtracting. And our process is going to be the same. We're just going to change our operation from addition to subtraction. Let's look at the equation 2/3 minus 1/6. Now, again, my denominators are different numbers. They're not like denominators. So I need to figure out how I can convert those to where my denominators will be like denominators. Well, in order to do that, I want to take my 2/3, okay, and I want to find an equivalent fraction where my denominator equals 6. Okay. And you're always going to take the fraction where your denominator has a lower value, in case you haven't caught on to that yet. So let's look at 2/3 minus 1/6. Well, let's look at our denominators of 3 and 6, and let's talk about our multiples of 3 and 6. Okay. My multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and I'm going to stop right there. Okay. Let's look at our multiples of 6. 6, 12, 18, 24, 30. Right. And again, I'm just going to do a couple of them. Now remember, we want to take our least common multiple, just like we did when we were adding fractions. Right. Well, the common multiples I have are 6 and 12 and 18. Right. I want to take that least common multiple, which is 6. Right. Well, 1/6, my denominator already equals 6, so I'm going to keep it the same, because remember, you want to essentially make your denominators equal that least common multiple. Okay. So 1/6 is the same. I'm going to take my 2/3, and I need to make that denominator, which is 3, I need to convert it to a 6. Right? Well, I know that if I take 3 and I multiply it times 2, that equals 6. And whatever you do to the denominator, you have to do to the numerator. Okay? Well, I know that 2 times 2, if I rewrite it, is 4. And I know that 3 times 2 is 6. And I know that if I have 2/3 and 4/6, those are actually equivalent to each other. They carry the same value. My numbers are just different terms. Okay, so if I take 4/6 and I take one of those 6 away, I now have 3/6. And I know that 3/6, you guys are pretty good with halves, so I know that 3/6 simplifies down to 1/2. So 2/3 minus 1/6 is 1/2. All right, let's look at one more example. Let's look at 6/8 minus 1/2. Okay. Well, again, just like the before examples, my denominators are different. Okay. So I have the denominators of 8 and 2. Well, essentially what I want to do is I want to make these denominators like. Well, I know that 8 is my higher denominator, so I want to convert my 1/2 to some type of equivalent fraction where my denominators are going to equal 8. And just like before, the easiest way to do that is to look at my least common multiple, okay, my LCM. Let's look at my multiples of 2 and my multiples of 8. Okay. My multiples of 2 are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. My multiples of 8 are 8, 16, 24, 32. Okay. And let's look at my common multiples that I have here. Well, the multiples that I have in common, and it looks like there's just one of them, which is 8. So that just so happens to be my least common multiple. Okay. Well, 6/8, my denominator already equals 8, so I'm going to leave it alone. And I want to take my 2 and I want to convert that to an 8. I know if I take 2 and I multiply it by 4, that equals 8. And whatever I do to my denominator, I'm going crazy, y'all. Whatever I do to my denominator, I also do to my numerator. So 1 times 2 is 2, and 2 times 4 is 8. Right? And let's go ahead and subtract that. If I take 6/8 and I subtract or take away 2/8, I now have 4/8. Okay. And for some of you, or for most of you, you know that that simplifies down to 1/2. But let's talk about how we can get that down to 1/2, just so we can review it one more time. All right, so if I have 4/8, and if you can already pop in or think in your head that 4 and 8 already have numbers in common. Again, when we're simplifying and we're taking something into lower terms, we want to talk about the greatest common factor. Okay, and again, just to remind you, I have attached that anchor chart, and I would definitely use that for this unit, because you're going to have to know the difference between a least common multiple and a greatest common factor. So let's look at the factors of 4 and my factors of 8. Well, I know that 1 goes into 4, and 4 also goes into 4. If I multiply 1 and 4, that equals 4. And then I also know that in between that, if I take 2 and I multiply 2, that equals 4. So those are my factors of 4. My factors of 8, if I take 1 and I take 8, okay, I know that equals 8. If I take 1 and I multiply by 8, that equals 8. And remember, in our last unit, we always said that no matter what number it is in the entire world, 1 and that number can always fit into that number. So if I have, for example, if I have 8, I know that 1 and 8 always will fit into 8. So we always started with that one just because it was easier. So let's keep moving on. We'll have 1 and 8 equals 8. And then I can also take 2 and 4, and that also equals 8. Okay, and that's really all about the numbers or the factors of 8. There's really not anything in between 2 and 4 besides 3, and I know that 3 doesn't go into 8. All right, so let's talk about my factors they have in common. They have 2 in common and they have 4 in common. Again, you want to take the greatest common factor. Make sure you don't get that confused with the least common multiple. Okay, my greatest common factor is 4. So I want to take that factor and I want to divide it. Because remember, we're putting it in smaller terms. So we're going to divide it up to put it in smaller terms. Well, I know that 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 8 divided by 4 is 2. So my final answer is 1/2. Again, I know that most of you are to the point where you know that 4/8 simplifies down to 1/2. I just wanted to quickly explain why it simplifies down to 1/2. So 6/8 minus 1/2 is 1/2. So that's all I wanted to show you for right now for adding and subtracting fractions. I just wanted to say I miss you guys so much. I think about y'all every day. And I know that we can get these next few weeks, we can get it done together. And I know that I'll be looking forward to seeing your happy faces. And if you have any questions or your parents have any questions, please, please, please reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to help you guys. I know that this is something you guys have never seen before. So if you're just bear with me and we work together as a team, I know we can get through this. So again, I miss y'all so much and I cannot wait to see you soon. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks.